Good afternoon. Welcome to the Logistics Business Virtual Show. I'm Paul Hamblin. I'm editor of Logistics Business magazine. Welcome to the second in our series of expert panels looking at themes and issues and business concerns around the area of logistics across the whole piece. The theme for our panel here is the issue of transport friction, and it has quite a UK base, but we will also be talking about European issues as well. And I'm joined by two expert panelists from the industry, so I'll ask them briefly to introduce themselves now, starting with Tom Southall.
Good afternoon, Paul, and hi everyone. My name is Tom Southall. I'm the Policy Director at the Cold Chain Federation, and we're the trade body for the UK's temperature-controlled logistics industry. So our 190 approximately members operate temperature-controlled vehicles, but also cold stores kind of across the UK.
Thank you. And Tom Summer.
Hi Paul, thanks for the introduction. My name's Tom Summer. I'm the Development Director for Channel Ports. We are a UK customs agent, and we also own and operate Stock 24 lorry park on the M20 just outside of Folkestone. I come from a background of shipbroking. I'm a fellow of the Institute of Shipbrokers, and I joined the customs clearance business in 2017 in preparation for Brexit.
Thank you. Well, it's fascinating that this is a subject that is not only in the business pages at the moment, but also on the front pages and leading news agendas, i.e. supply chain issues throughout British industry, and the issue of freight and transport is right at the heart of it. So Tom Southall, if I could come to you first, driver shortages, what are the causes in your view? Let's start on what are the causes of these driver shortages that are giving so much concern across industry?
Yeah, so it's a huge issue, and it's safe to say it's been growing for some time. So I think the first thing to say is that on the driver shortages, it's not necessarily a new issue. It's one that's been building for some time. Figures from the Road Haulers Association suggest there was a shortfall before kind of Brexit and COVID and things like that started to take effect. But what we've seen more recently is issues like Brexit, like COVID, some tax changes as well that have affected agency workers. Lots of things all kind of coming together to really cause a real shortage in not only drivers, but across the supply chain as well. There's difficulties picking food in our fields, manufacturing, processing food, right through to distribution, and issues on the shop floor as well. So it's a widespread issue. Difficult to say exactly. There isn't one single cause, as I've said. It's a combination of issues. But perhaps the biggest reason for the driver shortage is that historic shortage, coupled with the reliance kind of pre-Brexit on Eastern European labour, which we've seen kind of following the new immigration rules, following Brexit, lots of those workers not able to be here and work anymore, and also COVID-19, which had a similar impact. That actually, and perhaps it's the more unexpected change, was that when the pandemic hit, lots of people deciding to go back to their home countries to see out the pandemic with family and friends and things like that, and actually lots of those workers haven't returned. So there's a big gap in sort of the labour market from that perspective, and yeah, it's hitting all parts of the supply chain at the moment, and showing little sign of kind of easing up.
And is it Tom? Is it because it's an ageing workforce? Is it because the industry is not seen as attractive enough? Why are we seeing a decline in homegrown drivers? I know there's also an issue with the testing, is there not?
Yeah, that's a very good point. Testing has also been a big issue because we effectively stopped HGV tests during the pandemic. So there's a huge backlog. And one of the things the government has done is try to sort of streamline that testing. So they've made more testing slots available. They just announced last week some measures to kind of shorten the process to try and get more new drivers sort of trained up. But you're absolutely right. It's a legacy issue. The average age of a HGV driver is well into the 50s, and for quite some time it hasn't been seen as a kind of a sector, I think, that younger people have wanted to get into. So actually, as well as trying to alleviate some of those short-term issues around getting people into trucks and getting supplies delivered, we also need to look at how we kind of reinvigorate the industry and promote the industry and attract that new labour back into the industry.
Yeah, we'll come on to that in a second. But just on this issue of causes, yeah, so it's a legacy issue, and I understand that. Is it fair to say that then the fact that we had all these East European drivers, it masked that, it covered that there was a lack of homegrown drivers, and then it was the Brexit decision that ultimately then forced it into the open because we no longer had those drivers there?
Yeah, I guess so. I think it obviously is well known within the industry kind of where our labour kind of came from, and it's not the same kind of across the country. There's certain areas where perhaps we've relied more on Eastern European labour, perhaps in the east of the UK around some of our growing areas, and there's lots of logistics businesses based there, because that's where lots of food is grown. So I think we knew that part of that labour pool would be lost. I think probably the biggest mask has perhaps been kind of COVID and perhaps the furlough scheme as well, where we've seen, during COVID, the hospitality industry particularly, seen lots of disruption to food supplies, and actually understanding what the impact of Brexit was somewhat masked by the fact that restaurants were shut, the way we were buying groceries and the pressure on retailers was fluctuating massively. So I think it's only been when we've started to return to some degree of normality kind of over the summer, and lots of those businesses have got up and running again, and demand for logistics and other services has grown, that actually the issue is kind of really sort of settled in, and we really see the impact of that.
Tom Summer, is there anything from your perspective to add to that explanation?
Yeah, as Tom said, simply the demand for transport is increasing, whilst the pool of talent is contracting. And obviously the problem is it's not just compounded to the UK, as Tom mentioned, it's seen across Europe. And obviously these numerous factors that have exacerbated the situation beyond the pandemic, beyond Brexit. You've got, the IR35 tax reform. So agency labour has been forced into withdrawing their services, and the ageing workforce. I believe, Tom, you may want to correct me, but I believe the average age of a driver is about 50 years old, and unfortunately, the industry suffers from an image problem. Young adults getting into the profession, and they're faced with very high barriers of entry. Costs in the region of £2,000 for HGV training and testing. So, how do you get around this? Can the government do more? Can the government subsidise these tests? I don't know the answer, but it is a crisis that will continue to spiral unless something is done.
So let's getting on to short term. I do want to talk about potential long term, how we're going to cure it, but just in the short term, there's a lot of Christmas is going to be cancelled stuff going on in the popular press. Tom Southall, what's your view on that? Do you think the industry can cope, or do you think we are going to see serious shortages in the run up to Christmas?
I think talking about sort of strictly logistics, logistics is about solving problems, and what we've seen throughout the pandemic is that, and sort of Brexit stockpiling issues as well, is that the cold chain and supply chain is very resilient, and there's lots of very good professionals out there trying to do the job at the moment. And Christmas starts now, from a logistics perspective. A lot of the planning is happening now, but I think it is inevitable there will be some form of disruption, just because the disruption we're seeing at the moment, the gaps in the labour force, and actually the requirement for logistics service only grows between now and Christmas. So I think we will see some form of disruption, but I don't think Christmas isn't cancelled by any means. It will just mean, as we're seeing at the moment, that there are disruptions in supply, so you might not be able to get everything at once. But there isn't so much a shortage of food; it's just a difficulty getting food in the right places, and the system is a bit slower than perhaps it is on a normal sort of basis.
And of course, we saw with COVID, didn't we, in that first lockdown, how quickly the industry was able to adapt and get the shops, filled up. Yeah,
absolutely, and that will continue to happen. But I think we need to bear in mind there are a lot of kind of stressed logistics professionals out there. The people who are still doing the role are working extremely hard, working overtime, and we do risk kind of burning out the workforce that we've already got. And I know sort of our members are finding that a real challenge. But but they're also doing things in the short term to try and retain the staff they've got.
So paying quite big bonuses, right? And quite. I'm hearing anecdotally, I hear about drivers paid fees just to turn up on the day, etc., or double and treble time and all this kind of stuff. Is that what you're hearing? Or?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly, there's plenty of news stories out there about that occurring. I think more commonly we're seeing kind of wage increases, so quite significant wage increases across the board, and then businesses obviously having to keep up. Some businesses choosing to more actively go after new staff, but I think more commonly is wage increases, and then looking at ways to listen to staff and listen to why they might be considering moving out of the industry, and the barriers to people coming in, which are often things like the unsociable hours and weekend working, additional benefits like pension provisions and things like that. So really trying to look at, I guess, adapting the job to suit employees a little bit more, and hoping that has a sort of short-term impact.
And do you think the industry has a lot to do in that area? Do you think it is behind other sectors of the wider economy in providing those sort of benefits to drivers?
I think pay standards for a trained HGV driver, pay is pretty good. It is some of those other things that, and the COVID pandemic highlighted, I think, people's attitudes to flexible working changing, and people getting used to home working and spending a better work-life balance, and I think that's all had an impact. So I think businesses are trying to adapt to that, but I think we've got a lot to look at ourselves a little bit as well, sort of as a society, and perhaps in how we treat drivers. Lots of the feedback over the pandemic was fairly hostile treatment out on the roads, rest areas and things like that, whilst drivers are out there doing their critical work, are very poor, and actually that public perception of how we treat our drivers really needs to change, and that's all part of that picture of growing haulage as an attractive proposition to people looking for work.
And of course, emphasising that they're key workers, as you said, as we saw with warehouse and supermarket staff, etc. During the...
Yeah, I mean, all anyone involved with food distribution was a key worker. So drivers driving food trucks and other services as well were key workers. They carried on coming to work while lots of us were locked down at home. Yeah, they are key workers, and I think sometimes that is forgotten, that pretty much everything we rely on is transported around the country on a truck. So I think we all have a duty to kind of appreciate that a bit more and respect the profession a little bit more.
Sure. So basically, there's, from your point of view and the Cold Chain Fed's point of view, there's no silver bullet to how we're going to fix this. It's a combination of things. It's better salaries, better workers. It's faster testing because of the backlog, and it's better treatment of staff within the industry once they're in it, I think. Was that fair to say? Yeah,
I hope all that will have an impact, but that is not short term. That sort of stuff will take quite a long time to filter through. Yeah. What lots in the industry, and not just logistics, but across the food supply chain, were calling for was more support from the government in perhaps temporarily allowing some of those workers we've lost from Europe to come back, perhaps on a sort of short-term visa in the interim. But currently, there's not a lot of traction on that. Government is very reticent at changing its immigration policy, and even that perhaps wouldn't be a silver bullet. There's no Tom outlined this issue is fairly widespread. There's issues around Europe with driver shortage as well. So there is no guarantee that if we looked at that, all of these workers would come back and solve our issues. But it's very difficult to find short-term solutions. I think freeing up testing, okay, although there's still a big backlog. I think Tom's right, trying to find a way of sort of funding the quite expensive training for new drivers is part of it. And then, that long-term looking at kind of standards and wages within the industry. But none of those are a short-term fix, unfortunately.
Sure. Tom Summer, coming on to the area of borders, I do want to talk in a minute about the recent government decision to delay on the agri-food. But are you conscious that border problems are also contributing to these supply chain shortages that we're reading so much about?
Obviously the implementation by the French at the beginning of the year for drivers to be COVID tested, sure, that would have had an impact. But in terms of post-Brexit border-related issues, I don't see that as impacting the shortfall of drivers. I think it is down to The reasons Tom mentioned, and I don't think it's the border. I don't believe it's the border issue, because there really hasn't been much of a problem at borders. The nightmare scenarios we were told in the run up to Brexit really haven't played out yet, and certainly on UK exports, you're not seeing the ports congested. So, no, I don't believe it's a border issue that's contributed towards driver shortfall.
Do you think we will experience a kind of, not seismic, but a reaction to Brexit, post-pandemic, and we'll see the real reactions to Brexit in the month?
I think, personally, I'd argue that only UK exporters have really seen the full impacts of Brexit so far. For importers, it's all still to come. It hasn't played out yet. The UK government, they'll introduce controls, the same controls on imports from the EU as they do with goods from the rest of the world. As we've seen this week, as you mentioned, the government have pushed back the deadlines on pre-notification.
Well, I wanted to ask you to give us quite a lot of detail on that. If you could give us the background to this, why it's happened, and where you think that's all headed, and what you think can be what industry needs to do about it, basically.
Why the government have been pushed into this situation? The fact is, traders they're not prepared. The government have done very little in their communications to get traders prepared. But there's a lot of reliance on private sector. A lot falls on our shoulders to get our customers prepared. The government's communications has been pretty poor so far. So lack of preparation, driver shortage, this has all contributed towards the announcement by Penny Mordaunt to postpone these implementations. So obviously deadlines on the pre-notification of agri-food imports, so from the 1st of January, and then physical checks on certain SPS goods from the 1st of July next year. They're the new milestones. And after chatting to some of our customers that are impacted by those implementations, this move has been well received because they are underprepared. And what they are telling me, this reoccurring theme, is that the government's communication must be improved, and they can't just rely on, as I mentioned, the private sector to keep pushing out this information. They need the support. Traders need the support. So far, they haven't seen it. There's still a lot of confusion out there, and our customers, even though, as I said, Channel Ports are a customs broker, but our customers are turning to us for advice on non-customs matters. So that's a recurring theme at the moment. Yes, very well received, this announcement, but it's going to be wasted unless the government up their support
for communicating. What is it? Are your customers that are coming to you on non-customs matters, are they justified in that because it is so complicated what is required in this post-Brexit world, or not? Is it just simply a failure of communication?
It's a mixture of both. It's certainly a failure of communication, a lot of failure of communication. And so the government will publish their border operating model, and it's down to us to break that down and put it in a real scenario for our customers.
Is it feasible, what their border operating model?
Is it
feasible? Is it realistic?
I think so. I think it is. But then again, as a spectator of the Brexit negotiations, at the time I remember thinking most of the friction and the biggest impact on traders would be the UK setting different standards to that of the European Union, especially when it comes to food and plant products. That was when we were going to see the friction. Of course, any alignment on standards would mean relinquishing some of that, take back control mantra. But unfortunately, this is what the UK are now doing. We're having to set different standards on food products and whatnot, and ultimately it's going to be the UK importer that suffers the most. And we're yet to see that, I'm afraid. That's all coming down the line. So yeah, it does concern me. I am concerned. I do welcome the government's announcement of the delay. We just need to really utilize this period to prepare, and they got obviously, and the government need to lend their hand to traders for their support, because
How can your company assist customers? What are the sort of things it can do to help? There's an opportunity.
Our USP is providing traders, first-time traders who have no experience of customs. Okay, they've traded between GB and, well, they've traded intra-EU for 30 odd years. Now, the UK being a third country, they're now left with having to handle customs declarations. So shortly after the 2016 referendum, we saw this as an issue. One, we saw this as an issue. Two, obviously, lack of customs intermediaries in the marketplace. So we had to sort of disrupt the thinking of the customs process. The customs process is very manual. It's pretty archaic, whereby a trader would email a copy of their commercial invoice to a customs broker, and the customs broker would prepare the import or export declaration. So we had to rethink this process. So we built a piece of software, a web-based software called Customs Pro. It has API capability. It's stripping the complicated jargon away from the process. All we're asking a trader to do is log on to Customs Pro. They enter some very basic data that they have in their commercial invoice, and this then communicates to Chief in order to generate the declaration. And what we're seeing is rapid turnaround times, and there's no bottleneck situation. We're not relying on our own internal agents to do all the data entry. They don't have stacks of emails to get through. So far this year, it's been a huge success. And when we built it, as I said, we had in mind, importers, exporters doing it for the first time. It wasn't built with freight forwarders or hauliers in mind, because they already know the process. But the majority of our business just tends to happen to be freight forwarders and hauliers, because at the moment they are the ones insisting on taking the responsibility of the customs paperwork. If they carry the goods, they want to handle that piece of the process. It's just fine by us. So, and another point, that there are a lot of new entries, customs intermediaries coming into the market this year. On the HMRC website, there's a list of customs agents. That has grown tenfold. So there are a lot of new players in the market, but how many experienced customs agents really are there? There's still certainly a lack of customs agents. So if we can rely on tech, that has to be the way forward. We are trying our best to speed up the process, and so far, we're seeing some really good results.
Right, and will it have the flexibility to deal with these complicated new changes when they eventually come in?
There will be agents. There will be customs agents taking on additional declarations, such as the IPAFS declaration. However, that really sits outside of their remit. It's not a customs declaration.
Yeah, sure.
It's down to the importer to make those declarations. Sure, there will be agencies offering that solution, but at the end of the day, it's not a customs declaration. So
it's part of the confusion, I suppose.
That again, I'm pretty sure that will be falling in the laps of the importer, that declaration.
Right. Let me come back to Tom Southall at the Cold Chain Federation. We've heard about some pretty serious challenges with driver shortages and delays and friction there. What are the other big challenges in your view, facing the industry at the moment?
Well, obviously, yeah, we've heard about Brexit issues, and I definitely agree with pretty much everything.
I mean, there's quite enough so far, isn't there? But
yeah, still recovering from the COVID pandemic. But I think long terms, when we talk specifically about the cold chain, the biggest risk, I think, is very much sort of the drive for sustainability and net zero, because cold chain uses refrigeration. We're a high energy using sector, so in our buildings we use a lot of energy to power refrigeration equipment, and on the vehicle side, refrigeration on vehicles is primarily powered by diesel, whether that's from the main engine of an HGV or from a separate auxiliary TRU diesel engine. And particularly in urban areas, those are coming under increased scrutiny. And anyone who's been paying attention to sort of climate change policy and things like that over the last 18 months will have been left in no doubt that, COVID pandemics and Brexit haven't halted the government's kind of pledges around net zero. We've seen interim targets come in, 70% emissions by 2035, I think it is, I always get that wrong. The transport decarbonisation strategy published last month, hydrogen strategies, industrial energy strategy, I forgot the name of that one, but anyway, lots of things coming in, all adding pressure.
Is it your view that those targets, sorry to interrupt you, but is it your view that those targets are feasible?
You mean the wider kind of net zero by 2050?
Yeah, there's sort of, because they had 2040, didn't they? They brought, and I know that's not specifically cold chain stuff, but
well, I mean, interestingly, I think earlier this year we hit halfway apparently, didn't we? Because we reduced emissions by 50% by from a 1990 baseline. Lots of that was because we weren't traveling, and lots of dips from kind of transport emissions. So we are expected to go back up next year. But all of that pretty much is due to changes in our energy supply. So pretty much switching off coal power stations. If you look at emissions from transport, if you look at emissions from industry, other sectors as well, we haven't made that much progress. So I think it's going to be a real challenge. And actually, we struggle a little bit with understanding the messaging around what a net zero, what does that actually mean for industry. Refrigeration, for example, we're always going to use energy. So if we source all of our electric for our cold stores from renewable sources, is that net zero? We're always going to use energy. So part of the difficulty is actually understanding what those big targets actually mean for individual sectors.
Definitions are vague, definitely.
Yeah.
You talk about neutral and are not the same thing, yeah. So
we might be able to hit some kind of definition of net zero, but quite what that is, I'm not sure. But a lot of work's required, and that's all putting pressure on operators of the cold chain, because we're having to. Yeah. So if you look at energy efficiency within cold storage, but also looking at how we can transition away from diesel in refrigeration on vehicles as well. So that takes up a lot of our time.
And is the industry on the path to doing that, do you think? I mean, I do see, technology coming in from cold chain suppliers that is very much geared towards carbon reduction.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're making really good progress. The Cold Chain Federation runs the Climate Change Agreement for cold stores, which is the government's only kind of policy for trying to encourage energy efficiency in high energy using industries. And we've consistently hit those targets for a number of years, actually 15, 20 years. We've hit the efficiency targets, so we're being relatively more efficient in when we do it. But we think there's going to be a step change in the requirements for that. But on top of kind of obvious things like replacing LED lighting to LEDs and stuff like that, we're seeing lots more investment in renewable energy, so solar panels on the roofs of cold stores, anaerobic digester plants, biofuels, all sorts of things. So I think there is a real opportunity, and there's also opportunity for particularly in cold stores to be part of that future discussion on how the UK's energy is managed. The idea of using cold stores as a virtual battery where you store up energy and release it back into the grid when it's required, flexible demand, all sorts of things, using the heat that's emitted from refrigeration for, using for heating in other buildings and stuff like that. So there's lots of potential. On the vehicle side, we're seeing some really strong kind of innovation around electric trailers. So trailers that use batteries, harnessing, again, solar on the roofs of trucks, and also other means to generate energy. But we're a long way off kind of that being mass marketed at the moment. There's lots of issues around getting the infrastructure in place, bridging the affordability gap. But absolutely, there is potential, and there's lots of good work going on kind of within our industry on those issues.
With regards to transport logistics, we're seeing, I mean, and this of course has been driven by the drive to e-commerce. There's a real push for urban logistics, and that is a problem for transport suppliers, isn't it? Because you've then got the contrast with cities trying to make themselves more attractive, and you have ultra low emission zones. For example, we've got the one coming in London very soon. The prices are going up to enter London. What can the cold chain in particular, but what can transport do to make those changes affordable for itself?
It's a huge issue, and actually it's been sort of turbocharged almost by COVID, because we've seen lots more demand for kind of home deliveries for all sorts of groceries and products. So demand has massively increased, but as you said, so has pressure on certain types of vehicles and operations within urban centres. Things like noise, obviously air quality emissions and things like that. But what we are seeing is quite rapid change in that area. So that is an area where electric vehicles certainly are becoming more prevalent, because you're operating a sort of hyper-urban environment. You have less of the range anxiety you might have if you were trunking up and down the country. So we're seeing lots of electric vehicles coming in. And some quite innovative kind of ideas as well around reusing the rivers for places like Thames Gateway, where we're seeing big investments in kind of huge logistics centres kind of on the edge of London. And businesses looking at ways to go get products from those kind of centres into central London, looking at rivers, looking at drones, all sorts of things. And I think that's probably the biggest change, is the idea of, it's been talked about for quite a while, this idea of consolidation, whereas instead of 10 businesses all going into one location in central London, they all go into a centre on the edge of town, and then all of the loads go on one van and it goes in. There's been lots of that work. That sounds great in kind of theory, but competitivity issues and issues setting those up have kind of hindered progress. But I've heard lots of discussions recently that's kind of really coming into the fore now, and there's lots of businesses looking at those kind of models. So I think it is rapidly changing, but again, sort of innovation and businesses will find a way.
Right, and let me just talk about the future for a bit. We hear a lot about autonomous vehicles, and I remember there was some very exciting stuff about truck convoys through the Netherlands, where the first lorry was driven and the two behind were both empty. And what do you think is the future of that technology?
I'm not too sure on autonomous vehicles. I guess there clearly is a lot of research and things going into that, and perhaps again in an urban environment there's more potential for that, where you're running defined routes all the time, and perhaps there's a bit more infrastructure. I think for long distance trucking, when I started in this industry a couple of years ago, electric was talked about as never going to be a possibility, because it would never have the power, the batteries are too heavy. At least on the fridge side, we are now seeing technology come in on that, and there are starting to be trucks capable of that as well. And we're seeing things like, as part of the transport decarbonisation strategy, the government launched a trial into e-highways, the idea of having overhead cables on motorways, which sounds quite far-fetched, I guess, or at least difficult to achieve, but actually it would make sense, because those longer distance vehicles, that range is always going to be the issue. But if you could some way on our trunk roads, motorways, perhaps major A roads, have a way of charging them on the go, and then obviously charging in depots or switching to batteries for the last part of the journey, it does make sense. So I think electric does seem like it's going to play a major part of the future, but we can't forget things like hydrogen as well. It's very uncertain at the moment, but the government's just announced lots of research into that. So we should find out in the next 2 years whether we're able to scale up a hydrogen economy, and how that might impact kind of vehicles and logistics.
Okay, fantastic. Well, let's draw to a close. I'd like to come back to you, Tom Summer, if I may. clearly there's a lot of confusion, as you've indicated and described very well, regarding importing going forward, and its separation from customs matters. What advice would you give to someone in the industry who's worried about this, perhaps a haulier or a logistics supplier or even an importer themselves? What advice would you give about how they could prepare for these changes and make them as pain-free as possible?
I think is just keep your team, keep your team, keep that culture of constantly being adaptable, ready to change, because it's throughout. Obviously, we've been hearing for the past 4 years that traders need to prepare, but as I said, we really haven't seen the full impact of Brexit yet. So it's just being ready to adapt, be sympathetic to new ideas on processing, seek advice, seek some collaboration. When it comes to customs matters, customs agents are best placed to give you the best advice. Seek their help, and yeah, if you can, if there is a tech solution that's going to make your process more streamlined, try and just go with it. Don't be afraid of it. Take advantage of it. You will see the benefits in the long run. And there are a number of products out there. So that would be best advice. I think, from a customs perspective, I think we're going to see towards the end of the year a bottleneck scenario where customs agents are going to say, sorry, we can't handle your business, we've got too much on. The end of import easements is the end of this year. That comes to an end, those simplifications. So find an agent with scalability, find an agent who's thinking sort of slightly different from the norm, and that can handle your business. So yeah, from a customs perspective, that'd be best advice.
Thank you very much, Tom. Anything to add to that, Tom Southall?
No, I think that was very well put. I mean, I think that the overall message is, we're not up the woods in terms of disruption. I think delaying the import checks, I think generally is accepted by businesses as being positive, although actually not all. I think some of particularly the supermarkets who put a lot of resource and effort into preparing for the sort of targets as they were, the dates as they were, pretty frustrated, and it's those last minute decisions I think that really impact industry. So waiting right up until the last minute and then going on, actually you have more time. So I think we would really urge the government to work with industry on issues like that, so that they fully understand kind of the impacts of some of these decisions, not only on Brexit but also on, you talked about urban logistics, things like clean air zones, sustainability issues. We're really all about kind of promoting that link between industry and government, and supporting our members, businesses where we can to adapt to the the almost constant fluctuation and pressure and uncertainty at the moment.
Absolutely. Well, you do a great job with that. So thank you, Tom, and thanks to Tom Summer too. Just a message again to our audience: if you have questions for our panelists, please do use the text facility, the live chat facility that is on your screen, and we'll endeavour to get your questions answered by them for you. But to that. Until then, thank you very much to Tom Southall and Tom Summer, and I look forward to meeting you both again soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul.
Cheers.
Cheers, Paul.